speaking about the law and a bit of common sense, I want to talk about what's been going on in Brisbane, and I want to talk about it especially because if they don't get it under control in Brisbane, we're going to see this sort of activism around the country. People in Brisbane for weeks now have put up with a whole lot of spontaneous protests that have deliberately blocked traffic, small numbers of protesters deliberately blocking traffic, creating chaos, stopping people getting to work, stopping them getting to their medical appointments or visiting loved ones. And Extinction Rebellion are the activists behind this. They intend to keep going. And they have support from the Greens councillor on the Brisbane City Council, Jonathan Sri. He joins me now live from Brisbane. Thanks for joining us again, Jonathan. As a city councillor representing the ratepayers of Brisbane, you must have sympathy for the ratepayers of Brisbane and have some responsibility to try and ensure they can go about their lawful business without being disrupted repeatedly.
Yeah, and I definitely feel a lot of sympathy with people who are feeling frustrated, but I'm also hearing from a lot of ratepayers who are really supportive of the protests and are supportive of the issue more generally. And I think really that's what it comes down to, is that if you believe that climate change is being caused by human activity, and if you believe that that's a serious threat to our way of life and our society as we know it, then we do need to take serious action. And right now our government's not doing it. And I guess, it seems like people like yourself still don't believe that climate change is caused by human activity. So we've clearly got to push these conversations along a little bit further.
Well, no, I've never said anything as absolute as that, Jonathan. But what I would say,
so you believe that climate change is caused by human activity? Just to clarify.
No, just to clarify, Jonathan, I don't believe anything when it comes to science. I understand the facts, and I talk about the facts. And anyone who talks about belief in this debate is talking about something other than the facts. Now, the facts of the matter are...
Do you accept the scientific evidence that climate change is being accelerated by human activity?
There is indeed a large body of scientific evidence that says the changes in our climate can be, at least in part, attributable to human carbon emissions and other emissions. Now, there's no doubt about that. Well, the argument here is about policy responses and protest movements and politics. Now, you know as well as anybody else that stopping the traffic in Brisbane and stopping law-abiding citizens going about their daily business isn't going to do anything to change the global climate. And as a councillor, you must have some responsibility to make sure these protests are not disruptive.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the protest I organised over a week ago was completely lawful. We were actually organising a protest against what the Queensland Labor government is doing, and that's to restrict our right to peaceful protest and free speech. So the Labor government is proposing to introduce new laws that are going to make it much harder for people to gather in public places and to express their public views.
Yeah, they're trying to tidy up this situation so that they can protect the interests of Queenslanders. Let's get down to the tin tacks here, Jonathan, because you're in a very enviable position in many ways, because sure, you side with these green activists, these climate alarmist activists. You side with them, you support their aims.
Hang on a second, let's just unpack that word climate alarmist, because you said before that you accept the science that climate change is caused by human activity. So why would you call it climate alarmism when we know that's what the science is telling us?
Well, the science doesn't tell us the alarmist hysteria that we're hearing from a lot of people, Jonathan. You know that. Read the IPCC reports. We all know the climate is changing, and we all know that humans can have some effect on that. What we don't need is the alarmist rhetoric about every 10 years they're telling us it's going to be too late to act. Now, the point here is you support what the protesters are doing. You support political activism for more effort on the climate front. Now, that's fine. That's your political position. But you're in the enviable position, as I said, as a city councillor for Brisbane, of being able to at least get these protesters to make their protest in a way that does not disrupt the daily activities of their fellow Queenslanders. Why is their right to protest more important than somebody else's right to get to work or get to hospital?
Well, that's what's been really funny, is that for that last protest that I ignored, which was organised, which was a protest about the right to protest, we gave council and the police 8 days' notice. And we offered that we wouldn't march down Edward Street, blocking traffic. We offered that instead we would march down the Queen Street Mall and gather in the Queen Street Mall to minimise traffic disruption. But the Liberal National Party, which runs Brisbane City Council, said, no, we're not going to support you walking up the mall. You have to stick to the road. Then the Liberal National Party Lord Mayor, Adrian Schrinner, took me to court to try to prevent the protests going ahead.
And you won that right,
concern
and
here.
you disrupted it again. Now, you know, this has all come about because of these Extinction Rebellion protests, people super gluing themselves to the road, people putting canoes on bridges, they are taking actions deliberately to disrupt traffic. And it comes back to this point again, Jonathan. Why is it that these protesters think their right to protest should supersede the rights of other citizens to get to work, to get to hospital, to get to visit loved ones?
I think I'm working out what's going on here, and I think I'm starting to understand, Chris, that your whole role in this is to turn people against each other, to foster division,
Listen,
to foster
now,
hate,
Jonathan,
to make us all blame one another.
Jonathan,
when
this
what we should be doing
Jonathan,
is blaming the big corporations who are screwing over all of us. Now,
Jonathan, this is not about my role. You're the one who has a role in this. You're the one who has a role in this. And there's a very simple solution here, right? That as a mediator, if you like, someone with one foot in the city council and one foot in the camp with the protesters, you can come to some very straightforward agreement where they have their protests in parks, out the front of Parliament House, wherever. Not on the street, gluing themselves to the street, stopping people going about their lawful business.
Brisbane City Council won't allow people to gather in the mall and gather in that public space which is off the road. So the LNP is preventing people from gathering lawfully in parks and public squares. So that's not a problem of my creation.
So you're happy to have the protests.
Establishment.
You're happy to have the protests in parks, in squares, off the roads, not disrupting fellow Queenslanders.
What we need is to have a serious conversation about the ramifications of climate change, and I think you have to recognise that you have a national platform.
Jonathan, we've got a lot of opportunities.
Why aren't you reporting the fact that the Arctic forests are on fire? Why aren't you reporting the fact that the Amazon is on fire? These are the serious issues we should be talking about.
Here we go with the alarmism. There are fires every year in the Amazon. There are fires every year in the Arctic. There are fires every year in Australia. Now, let's get down to the protest issue.
How much coverage do you give into those important issues?
I talk about them a lot. I talk about climate change a lot, Jonathan. Now, here's the point. Will you undertake, as a Brisbane City Councillor, to liaise with the Extinction Rebellion protesters to ensure their protests are in parks, are in squares, are not supergluing themselves to the road and disrupting the daily activities of fellow Queenslanders? Otherwise, what are you doing in the City Council?
People have been doing those sorts of protests for years, and the government is not listening. That's the problem. I think you're still labouring under the misapprehension that we have a well-functioning democracy. That's the problem here, is that you think our political system is not corrupt.
Jonathan,
I'm telling you, our political system is corrupt. And you need to recognise and acknowledge that.
Jonathan,
you have an elected representative here who's telling you the political system is corrupt.
How did you get into the Brisbane City Council, Jonathan? How did you get yourself a gig in there?
We ran for election and we screwed over the major parties because they didn't see us coming.
There you go. Isn't democracy working just fine? You've got yourself a seat on the Brisbane City Council. You're elected to represent the interests of ratepayers. Surely you can broker an arrangement here where protesters can protest without disrupting everybody else.
Do you think big business has too much influence over our government? That's the simple question. Do you think big business has too much influence over our political
That is just silly stuff, Jonathan. Why don't you do your job and stop the protesters disrupting?
Have hijacked our political system, and you're here trying to put people to sleep when protesters are trying to wake them up.
Jonathan, you have a seat in the Brisbane City Council. You have a responsibility to ratepayers. Instead of talking about big business hijacking the planet, how about stopping your protesters from hijacking the streets of Brisbane and just organising for them to protest in the parks and in the squares where they can make their noise and law-abiding Brisbane citizens can go about their daily business?
Chris, will you call on the Liberal National Party to allow those protests to happen in the Queen Street Mall? Because I think they'll listen to you. They seem to listen to you a lot more than they listen to me.
Let's make it happen. I'll speak to one of their leading figures after this, Jonathan. Thanks very much. I love that undertaking. Jonathan Sri there, the Greens councillor for the Brisbane City Council.